The rejection letter was brutal. Inadequate physical performance, lacks tactical awareness, completely unsuitable for military service. Sarah Mitchell crumpled it up and left the training facility in silence, her dreams crushed. The other recruits whispered and pointed as she walked past them one final time. But when terrorists breached the compound's defenses and elite forces couldn't stop them, everyone would discover why some people aren't rejected because they're weak. They're rejected because they're too dangerous for anyone to handle. And today, that danger would be their salvation. If stories like this touch your heart, please hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are about the people everyone underestimated. Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of military service since she was 12 years old. Her father was a Marine, her grandfather served in Vietnam, and military tradition ran through her family like blood through veins. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, she spent countless hours reading military history books, studying famous battles, and imagining herself serving her country with honor. The walls of her childhood bedroom were covered with pictures of military heroes, maps of historic battlefields, and recruitment posters that promised adventure and purpose. Her fascination with military strategy began early, sparked by her grandfather's stories of tactical innovations during the Vietnam War. He would describe complex battlefield scenarios with the precision of someone who had lived through them, explaining how small tactical decisions could determine the outcome of entire operations. Sarah absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who knew she was learning about her future. During high school, Sarah excelled in subjects that required analytical thinking and strategic planning. Her teachers noticed her ability to solve complex problems by approaching them from unexpected angles, but they assumed this was simply academic intelligence rather than something more specialized. She participated in debate team, chess club, and academic competitions that challenged her strategic thinking. When she turned 18, Sarah applied to Fort Blackstone's basic training program with confidence that bordered on certainty. Her academic records were excellent, her physical fitness adequate, and her motivation unquestionable. She had studied military protocols extensively, memorized rank structures, and could recite the uniform code of military justice from memory. She packed her bags with excitement, believing she was finally beginning the life she was meant to live. But when she arrived at Fort Blackstone for basic training, everything went wrong from day one. The physical fitness tests were disasters that left her gasping for breath, while other recruits seemed to breeze through exercises. Where others completed obstacle courses in regulation time, Sarah struggled and fell behind, her face red with exertion and embarrassment. During weapons training, her aim was inconsistent despite hours of practice. Her drill instructors watched with growing frustration as she fumbled through exercises that came naturally to others. The disconnect between her theoretical knowledge and practical performance was jarring. Sarah could explain the mechanics of every weapon system perfectly, describe optimal shooting stances in technical detail, and recite safety protocols without hesitation. But when it came time to demonstrate these skills, something always went wrong. Her hands would shake during marksmanship tests, her timing would be off during combat drills, and her physical coordination seemed to abandon her at crucial moments. The mornings began at 0500 hours with reveille that jolted Sarah from restless sleep. She would stumble through the darkness to formation, watching other recruits move with military precision while she struggled to remember which foot to start marching with. During classroom sessions on military protocol and tactical basics, Sarah absorbed information quickly and could recite regulations perfectly. But when it came time to apply that knowledge in practical exercises, something always went wrong. Her bunkmates were polite but distant. They recognized that Sarah was struggling and instinctively distanced themselves from potential failure. In military training, association with weak performers could reflect poorly on everyone. Sarah ate meals alone, studied alone, and lay awake at night wondering why everything that had seemed so clear in her civilian life now felt impossible. The dining hall conversations she overheard were particularly painful. Other recruits would discuss their progress, share tips for improvement, and bond over shared challenges. Sarah wanted to contribute to these conversations, to share her insights about tactical scenarios they were studying, but her consistent poor performance had marked her as someone whose opinions weren't worth considering. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez pulled her aside after the third week. The conversation was brief and devastating. "Mitchell, I've been doing this for 15 years. Maybe the military isn't your calling." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had never considered that her calling might be wrong, that her entire life's direction might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of her own capabilities. Rodriguez's assessment wasn't delivered with cruelty, but with the professional detachment of someone who had seen many recruits fail and had learned to recognize when continuation would be pointless. His experience told him that Sarah lacked the fundamental attributes necessary for military success, and prolonging her training would only increase her suffering. Sarah pushed harder in response to the criticism. She stayed up late studying tactical manuals while other recruits slept, reading by flashlight under her blanket to avoid disturbing others. She practiced shooting techniques in her spare time, trying to understand why her performance never matched her knowledge. She could explain the theory behind every exercise perfectly, but when it came time to execute, her body and mind seemed to disconnect. The training schedule was relentless, designed to push recruits beyond their comfort zones and build military discipline through repetition and stress. Sarah found herself falling further behind as the weeks progressed. While other recruits adapted to the demanding schedule and began to excel, Sarah's performance remained inconsistent and often embarrassing. During combat simulation exercises, Sarah began to notice something strange. While she struggled with physical execution, she found herself analyzing the tactical scenarios in ways that differed from standard approaches. When her unit was tasked with securing mock enemy positions, Sarah would mentally redesign the entire operation, seeing alternative approaches that could reduce casualties and complete missions more efficiently. These mental redesigns happened automatically, without conscious effort. Sarah would watch training scenarios unfold and immediately see weaknesses in the approaches, opportunities for improvement, and alternative strategies that could achieve better results. But when she tried to share these observations, they were dismissed as the desperate attempts of a failing recruit to appear knowledgeable. The breaking point came during a major combat simulation exercise in the 6th week of training. Sarah's unit was tasked with securing a mock enemy position defended by instructors playing hostile forces. The scenario was designed to teach standard military tactics and demonstrate the importance of following established protocols. The mission briefing took place in a classroom filled with maps, tactical displays, and detailed intelligence about the enemy position. Sarah studied the information with intense focus, immediately seeing patterns and possibilities that the standard approach wouldn't exploit. The enemy position had obvious weaknesses that could be exploited with unconventional timing and coordination. While other recruits focused on executing their assigned roles, Sarah found herself studying the entire battlefield from a strategic perspective. She could see weaknesses in the enemy position that weren't being exploited, opportunities for flanking maneuvers that would avoid heavily defended choke points, and timing sequences that could coordinate multiple approaches for maximum effectiveness. During the mission briefing, Sarah suggested an alternative approach that would involve splitting forces differently and approaching from unexpected directions. The suggestion was met with immediate disapproval from Sergeant Rodriguez, who reminded her that military success depended on following orders, not redesigning operations. "Mitchell, you're here to learn proven tactics, not to reinvent warfare," Rodriguez said with barely concealed irritation. "These procedures have been developed through decades of experience and countless lives. Your job is to master them, not question them." But Sarah's suggestions weren't coming from arrogance or disrespect. Something deeper was driving her analysis of combat situations, something she couldn't explain to herself, let alone to her instructors. When she looked at tactical scenarios, she saw patterns and possibilities that others missed. It was like seeing the hidden architecture of warfare itself, understanding how individual movements could combine into larger strategic pictures. The simulation exercise proceeded according to standard protocols, and Sarah watched in frustration as her unit walked into predictable enemy responses that could have been avoided. The exercise concluded with acceptable results according to training standards, but Sarah knew it could have been executed more effectively with fewer casualties and greater strategic impact. Her frustration grew as similar scenarios repeated throughout training. Sarah would see tactical opportunities that weren't being utilized, strategic approaches that could improve outcomes, and innovative solutions to problems that standard doctrine didn't address effectively. But every attempt to voice these observations was met with reminders that recruits were there to learn established methods, not to question military wisdom developed over centuries. The psychological pressure of constant failure began to affect every aspect of Sarah's training experience. She developed insomnia, lying awake at night replaying the day's failures and trying to understand why her mind worked so differently from what military training required. She lost weight, her appetite suppressed by stress and anxiety about her future. Other recruits began to avoid her more obviously, recognizing that association with someone who was clearly going to fail could damage their own prospects. Sarah found herself isolated not just from social connections, but from the informal support networks that helped other recruits cope with training stress. The final evaluation was a comprehensive test covering everything from physical performance to tactical knowledge. Sarah approached it with desperate determination, knowing it represented her last chance to prove she belonged in military service. She studied every regulation, practiced every physical exercise, and memorized every protocol with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The physical fitness portion was a disaster that exceeded even Sarah's worst fears. Despite months of training, her performance on obstacle courses, endurance runs, and strength tests fell below minimum standards by significant margins. She could feel instructors shaking their heads as she struggled through exercises that other recruits completed easily. The weapons proficiency test showed inconsistent results that defied explanation. Sarah's knowledge of weapon systems was excellent, and she could disassemble and reassemble firearms perfectly. But her marksmanship scores varied wildly, sometimes hitting bullseyes with precision that impressed instructors, and sometimes missing targets entirely in ways that suggested fundamental incompetence. The tactical knowledge examination was where Sarah expected to excel, but even here she encountered problems that reflected deeper issues with military culture. The test required regurgitating standard military doctrine exactly as taught, with no room for alternative interpretations or innovative approaches. Sarah found herself writing answers that she knew were technically correct but felt incomplete. She could explain why standard tactics worked, but she couldn't express her ideas about how they could work better without violating the format of the examination. The test was designed to measure compliance with established thinking rather than innovative strategic analysis, and Sarah's mind simply didn't work in ways that standardized testing could measure effectively. When the results were compiled, Sarah's overall performance was among the lowest in her training class. Her physical scores were below minimum standards, her weapons proficiency was deemed inconsistent and unreliable, and her tactical examination, while technically accurate, was marked down for failing to demonstrate complete understanding of military hierarchy and protocol. Commander Hayes called her into his office for the final meeting that would determine her military future. The office was spartanly furnished with regulation furniture, military photographs, and awards that spoke to decades of distinguished service. Hayes himself was a career officer whose bearing reflected 30 years of military discipline and leadership. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you," he began without preamble. The words that followed were delivered with professional detachment that somehow made them more devastating than angry criticism would have been. Sarah sat silently, knowing what was coming but hoping against hope that somehow her dedication and effort would count for something. "Your test scores are among the lowest we've seen in recent years," Hayes continued, consulting her file with clinical precision. "Your physical performance doesn't meet our standards, your weapons proficiency is inconsistent, and your attitude toward established protocols suggests fundamental incompatibility with military structure." Hayes paused, studying Sarah's file with the thoroughness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Military service requires more than intelligence or dedication. It requires the ability to function within established systems, to follow orders without question, and to trust in procedures that have been proven through experience. Sarah wanted to explain that her questions about tactics came from genuine desire to understand, not from disrespect for authority. She wanted to describe how she saw warfare scenarios differently, how her mind processed strategic information in ways that might offer value. But Hayes's expression made it clear that the decision was final and further discussion would be unwelcome. "I'm recommending your immediate dismissal from the program. You'll receive an honorable discharge, but you're prohibited from reapplying for military service." The finality of those words struck Sarah like a physical blow. She had never considered that prohibition from reapplication might be part of her dismissal. The rejection letter arrived 2 days later, making everything official with bureaucratic language that reduced her dreams to administrative terminology. Sarah packed her belongings while other recruits watched with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them being sent home. She could hear whispered conversations about how she'd never belonged there anyway, how some people weren't cut out for military life. The packing process was emotionally devastating. Each item she folded and placed in her duffel bag represented a dream that was ending, a future that would never happen. The uniform she had worn with such pride on arrival now felt like a costume she had no right to wear. On her last day at Fort Blackstone, as security escorted her to the main gate in a procedure that felt like deportation, Sarah overheard Sergeant Rodriguez talking to another instructor near the administration building. "Some people think they can learn warfare from movies and video games. Reality is different." Mitchell was living in a fantasy. The words stung because they felt so far from the truth. Sarah hadn't been living in a fantasy. She had been trying desperately to translate her understanding of warfare into the practical skills that military service required. But somehow, the translation had failed completely, leaving her looking like someone who didn't understand the difference between theory and reality. Sarah drove away from Fort Blackstone with tears streaming down her face, watching the base disappear in her rearview mirror like a dream that had turned into a nightmare. 3 months of training, 3 months of pushing herself beyond every limit, and it had ended in complete failure that felt like a rejection of everything she had believed about herself. The drive home took 4 hours through countryside that had looked exciting and full of possibility when she'd made the same journey in the opposite direction months earlier. Now the landscape seemed empty and meaningless, a backdrop to personal failure that would define the rest of her life. She returned to her hometown of Cedar Falls feeling like a different person than the confident 18-year-old who had left with such high hopes. The town looked smaller somehow, its familiar streets and buildings reminding her of dreams that now seemed naive and unrealistic. Her parents were supportive but clearly disappointed, having shared her excitement about military service and struggled to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The conversations with family and friends were awkward and painful. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, but Sarah couldn't explain it in ways that made sense. How could she describe the disconnect between her mental understanding of warfare and her practical failures? How could she explain that she had failed at everything despite feeling like she understood military strategy better than her instructors? Sarah took a job at a local security company, Pinnacle Security Services, doing basic guard duties at office buildings and shopping centers. The work was mind-numbing compared to her military aspirations, involving mostly monitoring security cameras, checking identification badges, and walking patrol routes that never varied. Her supervisor, a retired police officer named Frank Morrison, was kind but clearly saw her as someone who had failed at something more ambitious and settled for whatever work she could find. The transition from military aspirations to civilian security work was jarring. Instead of studying tactical operations and military strategy, Sarah found herself memorizing building layouts and emergency procedures for office complexes. Instead of working with dedicated soldiers committed to national service, she worked alongside guards who saw their jobs as temporary employment while looking for something better. Her colleagues at Pinnacle Security were decent people who treated her well, but they didn't understand her background or aspirations. When they learned she'd been dismissed from military training, they assumed she simply wasn't tough enough for military life. Sarah didn't correct them because the truth was too painful and complicated to explain. How could she describe seeing warfare differently when she had failed at basic military tasks? The daily routine at Pinnacle Security became a refuge from thinking about her failed military dreams. Sarah worked night shifts at the Meridian Office Complex, a collection of professional buildings that housed law firms, accounting companies, and consulting businesses. The buildings were quiet at night, occupied only by occasional late-working professionals and cleaning crews. The night shift suited Sarah's emotional state. During daylight hours, when the world was active and purposeful, she felt like a failure who had been rejected from meaningful work. But at night, in the quiet corridors of office buildings, she could pretend that her current situation was temporary, that somehow her real life would begin eventually. 3 months passed in this routine of work, sleep, and trying to forget her military dreams. Sarah avoided news about Fort Blackstone and military operations because every reminder was like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. She stopped reading military history books and took down the military photographs that had decorated her apartment walls. Her parents and friends suggested that she consider other careers, pointing out that many successful people had faced early setbacks that led them to better opportunities. But Sarah couldn't imagine anything that would replace the sense of purpose she had felt about military service. Other careers seemed like consolation prizes, ways to pass time rather than meaningful work. Then came the morning that changed everything and forced Sarah to confront the very dream she had been trying to forget. Sarah was working the night shift at Meridian Office Complex, making her rounds through empty hallways and checking security systems, when her phone buzzed with an emergency alert at 0347 hours. The message was brief but devastating. Terrorist attack at Fort Blackstone. Multiple casualties. Base under siege. Sarah's heart stopped as she read the words, unable to believe that the place where her dreams had died was now under attack. She immediately turned on the security office television and watched in horror as news reports showed smoke rising from the base she knew so well. The same buildings where she'd trained, the same firing ranges where she'd struggled with weapons qualification, The same obstacle courses where she'd failed physical fitness tests were now battlefields where people were fighting for their lives. The news coverage was extensive and devastating. Reporters described a coordinated terrorist attack that had caught military personnel off guard during a shift change. The attackers had used knowledge of base procedures and layout to maximum advantage, seizing control of key buildings and taking hostages before effective resistance could be organized. The news anchor's voice carried the gravity of an unfolding crisis. Terrorist forces have breached the perimeter of Fort Blackstone and taken control of key positions. Military personnel are trapped in multiple buildings with no clear escape routes. The attackers appear to be using advanced tactical knowledge to counter every rescue attempt. Sarah watched footage of the base with intimate familiarity, recognizing every building and understanding the layout in ways that news cameras couldn't convey. She could see exactly what the terrorists were doing, how they'd positioned themselves to control movement throughout the facility. Their strategy was brilliant and terrifying, designed to maximize casualties while preventing any organized response. As more details emerged, Sarah realized the scope of the crisis. The terrorists had infiltrated the base during a shift change, taking advantage of a brief window when security protocols were transitioning between day and night procedures. They had seized control of the main training facility, the communications center, and key administrative buildings. The tactical situation was complex and devastating. The terrorists had positioned snipers to cover all approaches to buildings where hostages were being held. They had booby-trapped standard entry points and established overlapping fields of fire that made rescue attempts extremely dangerous. Military forces surrounding the base were essentially paralyzed by the sophistication of the terrorist defensive positions. Her phone rang while she was absorbed in the news coverage. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code matched Fort Blackstone. Sarah Mitchell? The voice was tense, unfamiliar, carrying the urgency of someone dealing with a crisis. This is Colonel Peterson from Fort Blackstone Emergency Command. I need you to come to the base immediately. Sarah's heart raced as confusion mixed with disbelief. I don't understand. I was discharged from training 3 months ago. The idea that anyone at Fort Blackstone would call her during a crisis seemed impossible. I know, but right now, you might be our only hope. The drive to Fort Blackstone took 25 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer, scenarios she couldn't understand. Why would they call her? What could a failed recruit possibly offer in a crisis that trained soldiers couldn't handle? Part of her wondered if this was some kind of mistake, if they had confused her with someone else. The radio news continued to provide updates during the drive, each bulletin more alarming than the last. The terrorists had made demands that were impossible to meet, threatened to execute hostages if rescue attempts continued, and demonstrated tactical sophistication that suggested extensive military training or inside knowledge of base procedures. She arrived to find the base perimeter transformed into a war zone that looked nothing like the orderly military facility she remembered. Emergency vehicles filled every available space, their flashing lights creating an apocalyptic atmosphere. SWAT teams, FBI agents, and military personnel from multiple units had converged on the scene, but despite all the resources and expertise gathered outside the base, the siege continued. The command post was a hastily erected tent complex filled with communication equipment, tactical displays, and personnel from agencies Sarah couldn't identify. The organized chaos of crisis response surrounded her as she was led through security checkpoints and identification procedures that confirmed she was expected. Colonel Peterson met her at the main command tent. He was a tall man with gray hair and worry lines that seemed to have deepened during the crisis. His uniform bore ribbons and insignia that spoke to decades of military service, but his expression carried the weight of a situation that was pushing him beyond his experience. "Sarah, I need you to understand something that wasn't in your military file," he said without preamble, leading her to a quiet corner of the command post. 3 months ago, when you were dismissed from training, it wasn't entirely because you failed standard requirements. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what he was suggesting. I don't understand. The idea that her dismissal had been anything other than straightforward failure contradicted everything she had believed about her military experience. Peterson activated a tactical display showing the current siege situation. Your instructors reported that you consistently suggested alternative strategies during training exercises. Strategies that violated standard protocols but demonstrated an understanding of warfare that most officers don't develop until years of combat experience. The tactical display showed the terrorist positions throughout Fort Blackstone, and immediately Sarah began to see the patterns. The terrorist positions weren't random or improvised. They were using the base's own defensive structure against the defenders, creating overlapping fields of fire that made approach impossible from standard directions. But there's something else you need to know, Peterson continued, pulling up additional files on his tablet. During your training, you submitted tactical analyses that our computer systems flagged as anomalous. Not wrong, just different. When our analysts reviewed them after your dismissal, they realized you were thinking about warfare in ways we'd never encountered before. Sarah looked at the tactical display again, studying the terrorist positions and defensive arrangements. She could see the solution forming in her mind, complex and requiring precise timing, but definitely possible. The terrorists had made their positions nearly impregnable against standard military tactics, but they had also created vulnerabilities that unconventional approaches could exploit. Peterson gestured to the displays showing casualty reports and rescue attempts. The terrorists have 43 hostages in the main training facility. They've booby-trapped all standard entry points and positioned snipers to cover every approach route. Every rescue attempt we've tried has resulted in casualties. The tactical situation was unlike anything Sarah had studied in training, but somehow she found herself understanding it intuitively. The terrorists were using a combination of military tactics that shouldn't work together, but were creating an almost perfect defensive position. Our best tactical minds are stumped, Peterson admitted with the honesty of someone who had exhausted conventional options. We've consulted with experts from every relevant agency, run computer simulations, and analyzed every possible approach. Nothing works without unacceptable casualties. Sarah studied the tactical displays for several minutes while Peterson and his staff waited in tense silence. She could feel the weight of their desperation, the knowledge that people were dying while she tried to solve a puzzle that had stumped career military officers with decades of experience. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah asked, still struggling to understand why anyone would turn to a failed recruit during a crisis of this magnitude. Peterson met her eyes with an expression that mixed hope with desperation. "I'm asking you to do what you tried to do during training. Look at this situation and tell us what we're missing." Sarah spent the next 15 minutes studying tactical displays, satellite imagery, and real-time intelligence reports while the command post continued its urgent operations around her. She analyzed terrorist positions, studied the base layout, and examined failed rescue attempts to understand what had gone wrong. "The terrorists aren't following one tactical doctrine," she said finally, breaking the silence that had settled over the command staff. "They're combining elements from 3 different military traditions in ways that shouldn't work together but are creating almost perfect defense." Peterson leaned forward, his expression intense. "Explain what you mean." "Classical siege warfare, modern urban combat techniques, and guerrilla positioning theory," Sarah continued, pointing to specific positions on the tactical display. "That's why standard counter-tactics aren't working. Each time you respond to one element, they counter with techniques from a different tradition." Sarah traced movements on the tactical display, showing how terrorist positions shifted in response to different types of approaches. "They're expecting you to respond to each element separately. If you treat this as a siege, they counter with urban combat techniques. If you respond to urban combat, they shift to guerrilla tactics." The insight was beginning to crystallize in Sarah's mind as she spoke. "They're forcing you to react instead of act, keeping you always one step behind their tactical innovations." "But they've made one crucial error," Sarah continued, her confidence growing as the tactical picture became clearer. "By combining 3 tactical approaches, they've created gaps in their coverage that wouldn't exist if they'd stuck to one doctrine." Peterson studied the display with new attention. "What kind of gaps?" Sarah pointed to specific locations on the tactical display, areas where terrorist coverage overlapped in ways that created brief vulnerabilities. "Here, here, and here. Their positioning creates momentary blind spots during shift changes, but the timing has to be perfect." Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a rescue plan that required split-second coordination and multiple teams moving simultaneously through approaches that exploited the gaps in terrorist coverage. The plan was complex, dangerous, and unlike anything in standard military tactics manuals. "This could work," Peterson said after studying her detailed analysis. "But it requires a level of precision we've never attempted before. The timing has to be perfect, and if any element fails, the entire operation collapses." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was proposing. "The alternative is letting them execute the hostages. The terrorists have made it clear that failed rescue attempts will result in casualties among the people they're holding." Peterson made the decision with the weight of command responsibility. We're going to try your plan. But Sarah, if this works, you need to understand something. This isn't beginner's luck or intuition. You're thinking about warfare at a level that most people never reach. The rescue operation began at sunset, when changing light conditions would provide additional cover for the approaching teams. Sarah remained in the command post, watching tactical displays and coordinating timing with military precision she'd never demonstrated during training. As the operation unfolded, every element of her plan worked exactly as predicted. The first team created a diversion at the main gate, drawing terrorist attention exactly where Sarah had anticipated based on their psychological profiles and tactical positioning. The second team used the blind spot she'd identified to approach the training facility unseen, moving through areas that terrorist surveillance couldn't cover during their shift rotation. The third team positioned themselves to cut off escape routes at precisely the moments when terrorist attention was focused on responding to the diversionary attack. When the final phase began, Sarah watched 30 years of military theory prove insufficient against unconventional thinking that approached warfare from completely different perspectives. The terrorists, despite all their preparation and tactical sophistication, found themselves responding to an attack they couldn't anticipate because it came from someone who thought about warfare differently than anyone they'd studied. The rescue teams moved with clockwork precision through approaches that exploited the vulnerabilities Sarah had identified in terrorist positioning. Within 20 minutes, all hostages were rescued, the terrorist threat was neutralized, and the siege was over with casualties far lower than anyone had dared hope. In the aftermath, as emergency responders tended to the rescued hostages and military personnel secured the area, Colonel Peterson approached Sarah in the command post where she was watching the final phases of the operation. That was the most successful counterterrorism operation in this base's history, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and amazement. 0 hostage casualties, minimal military losses, and complete neutralization of the threat. Sarah felt numb, struggling to process what had happened. I don't understand what occurred here today. The disconnect between her failure in training and her success in this crisis seemed impossible to reconcile. Peterson's response would change everything Sarah believed about herself and her military future. What happened is that you demonstrated tactical thinking that's beyond what we teach in military schools. Your mind processes warfare scenarios in ways that are completely unique. Over the following days, Sarah learned the truth about her dismissal from military training. Her tactical analyses during those frustrating months had been forwarded to advanced military strategists who recognized their significance immediately. Her suggestions weren't wrong. They were innovations that challenged established military doctrine in ways that threatened traditional approaches to warfare. We have protocols for handling recruits who struggle with standard training, Colonel Peterson explained during a follow-up meeting. But we had no protocols for handling someone whose tactical understanding exceeded that of their instructors from the very beginning. The military's response to unconventional tactical thinking had been to eliminate it rather than develop it. Sarah's dismissal had been partly due to genuine concerns about her physical performance, but largely because her innovative approaches to warfare didn't fit established training models. Sarah was offered immediate reinstatement in the military with advanced placement in tactical operations, skipping the basic training that had proved so frustrating. But more importantly, she finally understood why she'd felt out of place during those difficult months. She hadn't been failing to learn military tactics. She'd been unconsciously developing new ones that existing training programs couldn't recognize or accommodate. The news media never learned the details of the Fort Blackstone rescue operation. Official reports credited successful coordination between multiple military units, with no mention of the failed recruit whose unconventional thinking had made victory possible. Sarah's role remained classified, partly for security reasons and partly because explaining how a discharged recruit had saved the day would raise uncomfortable questions about military training protocols. Sarah chose to accept the military's offer, but with conditions that reflected her hard-won understanding of how innovation could be stifled by institutional thinking. She wanted to work in tactical development, helping to bridge the gap between traditional military doctrine and innovative approaches to modern warfare. She also requested that her story be used to review how the military identifies and develops unconventional tactical thinking, ensuring that future candidates with non-traditional approaches wouldn't be dismissed simply because their minds worked differently. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell graduated from Advanced Tactical Operations School with highest honors and recognition as the most innovative strategic thinker in her class. Her instructors were career military officers who'd learned to value innovation alongside tradition. understanding that modern warfare required both established wisdom and fresh perspectives. Her final thesis, on integrating unconventional tactics with standard military doctrine, became required reading for tactical officers and contributed to fundamental changes in how military training programs identified and developed innovative thinking. But perhaps the most important change was in how the military evaluated recruits who thought differently. A new program was established to identify candidates whose tactical thinking didn't fit standard molds, ensuring that future innovators wouldn't be lost due to institutional inability to recognize unconventional talent. Years later, when asked about the day she saved Fort Blackstone, Sarah would always emphasize that success came not from individual heroism, but from recognizing that different ways of thinking about problems can lead to solutions that conventional approaches might miss completely. She would also point out that some of the most important contributions come from people who initially appear to be failures, whose innovations are so far ahead of conventional thinking that they seem like mistakes until crisis reveals their true value. Sometimes, rejection isn't a verdict on your worth. It's evidence that you're offering something the world isn't ready to recognize yet. If you believe stories like Sarah's deserve to be heard, if you think the world needs more recognition for unconventional heroes who transform rejection into redemption, then please subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes, the most important voices are the ones that almost got silenced, and sometimes, the biggest victories come from the smallest acts of faith in human potential that refuses to be limited by other people's definitions of what's possible. Thank you for being here, and thank you for believing that every rejection might just be preparation for an extraordinary comeback that changes everything.